So I'll go ahead and start. My name is Dan Preby, and I'm an actuary. I grew up in the health field, so I've been an actuary now for about 25 years.
My name is Jim Miles. I've been a volunteer in the education system since the year after I became a fellow, became a fellow in 1980, so a long time ago.
Okay, hi, I'm Stuart Klugman. I'm currently a staff fellow working for the Society of Actuaries. Been doing that since 2009.
I know in some of the ERM readings last sitting, there was some opposing views. So one of the articles would say, you know, this is sort of like what you need to be looking at. And then you would read another article in the same list of objectives that would be like, well, but that really doesn't work practically. So it just seems like, I mean, it's good to present the two views, but it's just a little confusing. Like, is it really practical? Do you really want me to know how to apply it? Or is it more theoretical? And it just kind of leaves a little bit of confusion out there. Like,
So on the curriculum side, they try and vet that out there. Or they may actually be including that in order to give two opposing points of view, okay? And then on the exam side, what's happening is that not always, but sometimes the question writer will actually try and put together a question that will, say you have, just as an example, so you have a list of 5 things that may be out of the 2 different syllabus items that you're talking about, and only 2 of them are the best for whatever situation was posed in the question. It's actually up to the candidate to be able to surmise which 2 are actually the best. So while they may be opposing or not consistent with each other, it's still fair game for a question writer to write a question about it.
Yeah, I might,
In some topics, there just isn't a clear-cut one solution answer out there. It's something that's evolving or not settled, so there are different views. And so the curriculum committee was probably deliberate in some cases in saying we don't want to put one paper out there because that conveys that is the answer. We want to convey that there's more than one way to approach it.
there's also the case that as they grade papers, they're often looking more for your thought process and your understanding. And so if you were to write, well, there's conflicting views about this situation, but I think for the question that's been posed here, this is the appropriate response, and here's why. It's likely the case you could get credit either way, because if there really is more than one way to approach a problem, we can't, unless something in your reading has specifically said this is the right way to do it, we need to be flexible in accepting answers that take either approach.
And I'll jump ahead here. Even if it's not in the reading, so to say there was one paper in your example, but you're in an area of practice and you have other information, more current information or just different information. You say, well, I read this particular paper on the exam, but I know from practice that that's not always the way that it's done. There's other ways to do it. And so you write that on the exam. You say something like, the study note says this, but this is current practice. This is what should be done in this particular case. The grader should give you credit for that. Assuming that it's a valid answer, will give you credit for that, even though it's not necessarily in the syllabus.
And one last comment on this then. So you'll see this in later slides, but there will be a question in there again. If let's say that we had a situation where there was a list of 5 and you were to pick 2, and the list of 5 came from the 2 different syllabus items, right? Then what will happen is that on the question, it will say something like, justify your answer. And you'll have to justify it and say why you picked the 2 that you picked, okay? So I don't know if that addresses the question that you had, but...
Have we over-answered your question? So we need something to kind of tell us what level of knowledge you're at, and we're going to use a taxonomy, which is just a level of classification. And there's a couple out there. Benjamin Bloom was an educational psychologist, and he created a taxonomy like in the 1950s or so Marzano created a taxonomy in the 1970s. He was an educational consultant. He just basically took Bloom, made it a little more like science and engineering as opposed to liberal arts. And just one kind of caveat here is we're going to talk about taxonomies. We don't have one for actuarial science. Nobody's taken the time to create one for actuaries. So we're using one, Marzano's, that's primarily for grades K through 12, or up through high school. So this is Marzano's taxonomy in a very simple form, starting at the lowest level of retrieval and going up to the highest level self-system. So we're going to talk about the bottom 4 levels here, retrieval through knowledge utilization, and we're going to do it as if the Society of Actuaries has come to us and said, we're going to use Marzano's taxonomy as a basis for deciding what level of knowledge people have. And we're interested in these 4 levels, and we need a way to communicate between us, the Society of Actuaries, and the candidates, what that means, what retrieval means, what comprehension means, and so on. So we're going to start with retrieval, and so you guys are my verb committee, and you're going to help me come up with some verbs that you think would communicate to somebody else each of these cognitive skill levels. And we're fortunate today that we have two very senior experts over here that can help us out. They can be our judge, and if we're not quite sure whether it meets a certain level or not, they can step in and say, well, no, that's not a good word. So retrieval, repeating memorized facts. What would be a verb that would tell somebody that's what you want them to do? You just want them to repeat something. Yes, sir? List. Okay. Good one. Any others? Yes, sir. Define. Okay. Good. I'm going to come back to list and define. Yes? Outline. Okay. Keep that one. I think each of these you're giving me to me is a little bit beyond memorized facts. Yes? Identify, again, I think it's a little bit too far. So list, I would say, is retrieval if there's already a list in the reading. If I can point to page 3, the middle of the page, there's a list of 3 items, then I agree it's retrieval. But what if it's more than that? What if I say list and there's not necessarily a list in the readings? That's a little bit further, right? A little bit further beyond. Outline, kind of the same thing. You're asking somebody to take something and kind of distill it down. It's not really, unless the outline is already in the material and they're just repeating it. So think there's something in the I have my study note here. I've opened it up to page 5, and all I want you to do is tell me what's in the first sentence in the 3rd paragraph.
Yeah, Jim?
Yeah.
I just want to reemphasize the key here is all you're doing is repeating something that's already there. So like define, if it's a definition that's well known and clear, there's a unique definition that's been given to you for something, it's retrieval. But as soon as you have to put something in context or limit or expand on something, then you've moved up a notch.
Right. I mean, a retrieval question, I think, could be rewritten instead of saying, state the 3 reasons why. It could just simply say, in this study note on page 15, there's a list. Tell me what the list is. That's all it's asking you to do. So part of a retrieval question could be used to kind of help you do that reset. Say, we're kind of pointing you to where we want you to start thinking, and we're going to give you an easy softball type question so you can kind of get started, get warmed up, and kind of get headed to the right study notes, the right readings, the right objectives, all that kind of stuff, thinking the right way. The other reason for retrieval is there just are things that you should know, right? We as an actuary, there's things you just have to know, and having a retrieval question is one way to test that. So as we go on, I don't want to imply that there's little memorization with actuarial exams. There's a lot of memorization that has to go on with actuarial exams. The distinction is, what do you do with those facts after you've memorized it? Do you just spit it back to us, or do you do more with it? So let's move on to the next one, comprehension. So retrieval was just, it's there, you just gave it right back to us. This is the next level up. So if it's more than just giving information back, it's summarizing it, putting it in a different form, what words would, and I heard one already, outline is an example of this, where I take something and put it in a different form. Is there anything else that might be a word that, yes, sir? Describe, okay. Okay, so you've seen something, but you have to put it in your own words and tell about it. Yes? Explain, okay. Explain might even move into the next level, depends on what you're asking them to explain, but it's possible. Yes, ma'am? Summarize, what do you think?
I think you're moving up one,
Think I'm moving up one? Okay.
even though it's on your word there, even though it's on your list there.
Summarizing knowledge, yeah. Well, I think it's, that's one of those ones where it could cross over. And so some of these words we're going to talk about, it kind of depends on the rest of the context of the question. And you might also have to relate it to what you read. So if the question says list, and you say, yes, I know there was a list, I remember that list, I write it down, that's retrieval. If the question says list, and you think, wow, I don't remember a list in anything I read. I remember parts, in this part of this article there was some information, there was some information here, I can create a list, but there wasn't one actually given to me. That's the next level up. So the word itself is an indicator, but not an absolute indicator. Would you agree with that, that it could cross over?
I would agree with that.
Yeah, I think we would try to avoid using list when it's not a retrieval question. So if you actually have to think about, say the question asks you to provide 3 options that might be available, provide, there's that word, provide 3 options that might be available to the company in the case study. We wouldn't say list 3. We'd prefer not to say list 3 options because those 3 options may not actually be listed anywhere.
Right.
And it's actually up to you to analyze the situation and deduce 3 things they might do.
Right, and that's definitely the next level, if you have to
Yeah.
pull that information together and make a deduction. So let's move on to the next one. So this, once we move to the next level, we're asking for some choices to be made. So I heard earlier, compare and contrast. So compare and contrast implies I have to make some choices. I have a list, maybe 2 lists or two situations. What's the same about the 2 situations? What's different about the 2 situations? Anything else that I can you can think of for making choices? So compare and contrast. Yes. Rank, okay. Put them in order, the top 3, rank, whatever, yes. Recommend, I would say, really goes to the next level because you're asking, taking information and trying to make a decision based on that information. So we're not really, well, I mean, we are making choices or decisions here, but this goes beyond that, or recommend goes beyond that.
Jim, I have a question for you.
Yes.
Where does calculate fit into this? We're actuaries, we work with numbers, and occasionally our tests ask you to calculate something.
Well, I would say if it's a simple calculation, it might be classified as retrieval. I might put it there. If it involves just a little bit more of work, I'd put it up at the next level, analysis. If it involves trying to decide which information to use, maybe even which equation to use, which formula to use, then I would put it here with comprehension because I have to take stuff and kind of piece it all together and come up. So the word calculate could appear all 3 times. Probably a lot of the calculations we do as actuaries fall either under analysis or comprehension. The simpler ones are comprehension, the more elaborate ones are analysis. So there's two ways of testing analysis that are, that are good, things I like to do when I give exams. The first one is error analysis. So you're given a situation and you're asked to analyze it and make some decision about what's wrong. So when I give a university exam, what I like to say is an actuarial student who works for you has done some calculations and they presented you with a table of their results. Comment on their work, tell me what appears to be right and what appears to be wrong. On FSA exams, a lot of times it's the chief marketing officer of the company is kind of the fall guy for for the wrong answer. You know, the chief marketing officer of the company has made the following statement, and then you're asked to analyze his statement and make a recommendation. So something in it, it's not black and white wrong, it's right or wrong, black and white, right or wrong. It's something that's kind of on the edge of being right, on the edge of being wrong, and you're asked to look at it and make some decision about it. So you have to go beyond analysis and comprehension, comprehension and retrieval, and get to analysis and figure out, well, what could be wrong? You know, what can I say about it? This last line here, generalize to a specific situation or take a specific situation, generalizes, I think, where a lot of the FSA exam questions actually end up. So you're given in the stem of the question a very specific situation for a company or a product, and you're asked to make some analysis of that particular situation. So you have to think back through the readings that you had, and you say, well, I didn't have an example just like that in the readings. In fact, the examples didn't even, the readings didn't even have an example in them. There was just a lot of blah, 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 blah reading. And now, in this question, they've given me a very specific situation, and I have to apply my knowledge to that specific situation and figure out what to do with it. So that's the skill you need to have as an actuary, and that's what we want to test you on as an actuary. Going the other way, the readings have a very specific example given in them, but the question asks you for a different example, gives you a different situation, or asks you to generalize based on that specific situation. Can you do that? Can you take something that's the book is as an example, can you generalize from that and make it more applicable to all situations? I think, personal opinion, when I look through FSA exams, this is where they all kind of get set up. And even a case study question, if you've taken an exam that had a case study on it, which is like 40 or 50 pages of reading, that's really, you know, a specific situation that you're trying to take the other readings and apply those readings to that case study. Really fits into this. So the last...
So, Jim, can I add a few comments to this?
Sure.
So on the error analysis, just to give a couple of examples for the two different types. On the error analysis, on one of the previous exams several years ago, there was given an actuarial opinion. And there were certain things in there that were correct according to the actuarial standards of practice and certain things that were incorrect. And so you actually had to go through and list the ones that were incorrect or correct. And if it was kind of fuzzy, you had to justify why you thought it was right or wrong. Okay, so that was one example. And then the other one that was, it actually goes back to the previous types of questions that you have. And this is typically the way that a lot of exam questions are set up. So it's a situation where a company has the options of different distribution systems. So they can go to a broker, they can have an in-house distribution system, they can go to consultants, go direct from their in-house. Each of those have pros and cons depending on if it's individual, small group, large group types of business, okay? And so the way that the question is structured, and what you'll typically see the way that the question is structured, is it starts off with a generalized kind of a list question, then describe the attributes of the different distribution system, and then within the stem of the question it'll say that this is a large group carrier and or small group, and the chief marketing officer has asked you to use a particular distribution system. And then, like I said, A may be listed and describe each attribute of the different distribution systems, and then B may be comment on the chief marketing officer's recommendation, and C may be recommend your own and justify your answer. So as you can tell from that structure of the question, it's going from a very low cognitive level up to a higher cognitive level. Okay, and each question typically is set up in some way like that.
Any comments or questions? Yes?
Knowing that the questions build and that you might start at something that's a lower cognitive level where you're supposed to just recall or provide some sort of a list and a description. if you miss something key on that first part, are you then, does that sort of count you out for the rest of the question? Or, so if you were supposed to list 5 things and you miss one of them and it was a big one, what does that then do for you as you're building on kind of this faulty foundation?
Well, it really depends on the question, and I'll let Dan jump in here a little bit too, but we're trying to, I'd say as a general rule, trying to get away from questions that penalize you. If you can't do part A, then like you have no hope whatsoever on part B, C, D, or E, to make them somewhat independent, so that if you just mess up part A, you just draw a blank, you don't know it, that you can get the rest of them. So one way to do that, instead of asking you for a list, is to give you a list and then ask you to do something with the list. Is one way around that. With calculation questions, you do a calculation in part A. Part B could then say some other information was provided and the company decided to go with a different number, use this number in the rest of your calculations. So to get away from that. I'd say in general, if it says list 5 things, you only list 4, and the next part says using the list in A, yeah, you're just kind of out. I don't have any way around that. No
Yes.
nice way around it. But we're trying to get away from that type of question.
So in the situation you just described, let's say there is a list of 5 in A, and in B, you have to choose 2 of those, and one of them is one that you don't remember. You're out of luck, okay? Now, on the other hand, let's say that the B may actually be one where you may have 2 that you can justify and another 2 that you can justify, and so it's really based on your justification in that answer. And so in that case, you're not going to get penalized, okay? I want to mention something about calculation as well. So calculation. So here's the deal with calculation, in particular when you have to actually make a decision with it, okay? So in the grading process, you will be graded on the calculation itself. And let's say in that calculation, you make a mathematical error, but your process and the formula you were using is correct. You'll get nearly full credit for that. You won't get penalized too much for that calculation error, okay? Now let's say that part B of the question after the calculation is to make a decision based off of what your answer was off of that calculation. Okay, so what will happen is that within the guidance that's given to the grader will, that guidance will actually have, if the calculation came out to be this, here's the appropriate answer. If it turned out that you ended up with the incorrect one, here would be the appropriate recommendation or justification if it were this. And typically, I don't want to say typically, but let's say that it's if it's greater than a number, you'll do one thing. If it's less than a number, you'll do something else. On that part B, you'll get full credit depending on your justification for that answer. You're not going to get penalized because you did it incorrectly in A. That makes sense?
Just going back to what Dan was saying, how the question builds. I guess it's a 2-part question. I have seen where the verb is list, and it's just a list, and I have also seen it where it has a short definition next to it. Can you comment on, is list just like words, or does it need to have a little bit more of a sort of like understanding behind what you're listing? And then the second question is, if the 15-point question is to build from part A, B, C, and so forth, if you provide more detail than what they were looking for in part A, where you provide it in part C, where you just listed in part A, but then you explain it further down, do you still get the credit even though it wasn't in the right sort of spot?
Okay, so to your first question, if it says list, then you just list. If they want you to do more, it's going to say list and describe, list and define, list and explain, or something. There'll be something else that tells you need to go further than just listing. Agree, disagree?
I would completely agree.
Okay. The second part, your second question was, and I'm not sure if I thought I heard two things in there. Like if I say I answer part A, but I have more of the answer to A down in C, is that what you were asking? So
I still did what the total question is asking, I just didn't put in the right.
just put it in part A as part
Yeah.
B. Dan will talk about this later, I believe, but remember and this is, I think, is good. The people that are grading your exam took exams too. So they're not out there saying, I've never seen an actuarial exam before. I'm just paid to grade exams. I don't care what people say. This is what it says to grade. I'm grading it. They're volunteers. They've taken the exams before. They understand what it's like to take exams. So in that sense, they're going to do what they can to give you as much credit as they can on a question. So if you've answered something in C that maybe relates to A, you're probably going to get some credit for that. And it's hard. I don't want to be absolute, because then you'll come back to me in a year and say, hey, look what I did on this question. I didn't get any credit for it. Because then they have to go to the grader and say, well, what's going on here? But you have to think of the graders as it's generally being sympathetic to what you're going through, because they went through the same thing. So they're going to look for that type of thing. Is there something someplace else that they can, that you've demonstrated that you know the answer?
Yeah, their instructions are to do what you said, but it does put a little extra burden on you to still get across to them that you know what they want you to know. And anytime you make it a little bit more difficult, you do create a risk that they might miss it, but they're not told to ignore that or to not be strictly matching up their grading guide for A, B, C, D, and E to your A, B, C, D, and E. They're not told to do that.
Yeah, we're trying to test your cognitive skill level, not your cognitive skill level for question 7, part A, separate from question 7, part B, separate. It's your cognitive skill level. So in the totality of the test, what cognitive skill level have you demonstrated? So if you put something in C that kind of relates to A or helps out with A, like Stuart says, in theory you get credit for it, but you're putting the burden on the grader to see it and figure it out.
So real quick comment from the grader's point of view as well is the grader, as Jim has mentioned, has been through this, and they will typically almost always give the benefit of the doubt to the candidate, okay? What they're actually looking for in the questions that they're given is, has the candidate demonstrated that they know the material? That's really the fundamental question. And if within the answer that you've provided, whether it's in A or C, you've demonstrated that you know the material that's in that question, then they'll make sure that they grade it that way.
And one caveat, though, is each grader is going to have one question. So if I don't put stuff in question number 1, but I put stuff in question number 5 that's related to question number 1, tough luck. You don't get credit. You don't get cross-question credit. It's within the question. It's one question. The graders will look through the parts, but not between questions. So you can't write on a question, oh, I don't have time to go back to question number 1, but this, this relates to whatever. It's too bad. Oh, another question.
I just had a quick comment. I wanted to say that to Dan's point about the calculation question, I was shocked a year ago, when I got what I thought was very high credit, and I know that because I failed the exam, when there was a piece of calculation question that I did not know how to do at all. But the next step was to take the result of that and take 3 or 4 other numbers that were provided and do something further. I didn't have the answer to part A, so I just assumed a number and then moved on. And I got quite a bit of credit for that. So I just wanted to say that's a strategy I thought up at the moment, and it works.
Right.
So.
And that's a good technique. If you get stuck and you say, I messed up my calculation, I just assume that my answer is 5, I'm going to use 5 from now on, that's how it's going to get graded.
What we see a lot of when we grade them is we'll see, I don't have time to do the calculation. Okay, and people will actually write that down.
But they will write the formula often.
They will write the formula, and you do get credit for the formula when you write it down. Okay, so to your point, then write down an assumed answer and go on from there. And that's a fair strategy to take.
Yeah, you don't get all the points because you didn't do all the calculation, but you get, it's a time saver. And it doesn't penalize you then for the rest of the other parts.
Right, that's right.
Okay, well, we got stuck on analysis here. So knowledge utilization is the highest, and just kind of in the interest of time, I already heard some words that relate. So recommend, propose, those are key words that you're going to see. You're probably going to see them as like part E or F of a question. So you're given a specific situation in the STEM. You're kind of pointed to something that you're going to start thinking about. That's part A, part B, kind of get you started there. Then you get into comprehension analysis. Maybe you're doing some compare and contrast, some calculations. And then using, I mean, what we like, I think, ideally, every question to end up with propose or recommend. Because that's real life, right? When you're working as an actuary, you do a bunch of work. What happens to that number or numbers that you come up with? Some decision is made based on that, right? Some recommendation is followed through on based on that. So we like our questions to end up that same way. So having gone through that quickly with a little bit of a delay in the middle.
I might just add, Jim, some other words I think that
Okay.
go with that level would be critique.
Okay.
Did you say justify?
I didn't say justify. We did mention justify, but that's a good one to
Yeah, but
put.
justify, critique, propose, recommend.
Right, and a lot of the questions that say propose or whatever will also have the word justify in them. So to make it absolutely clear that you just don't say, I propose option A, and leave it at that. The word justify is in there, so you have to give an explanation why you picked. And a lot of questions are set up so if there's like two proposals, A and B. You get credit for either one. It's your justification that determines how much credit you get for the question. It's not necessarily a right answer.
I might add that would be one case where the verb is a signal that even if they don't say justify, you probably want to do it anyway. So
Right.
if it does say propose a strategy for this company from among the options presented, you even if they forget, we hope they don't, but if they forget to ask you to justify, that's probably a good strategy for you to do so.
Because we're assuming that they will.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so you saw this slide earlier, and Stuart said it was a bad slide because it had so much information on it. But the idea of putting it up here is, again, you see all these verbs that are underlined and highlighted on here. So when the curriculum committee writes this, they're thinking about what cognitive skill level they want it to be tested at. When the exam committee reads this, the same thing that you're reading, same words, that's what the exam committee's thinking of when they're trying to write the question. So if we move on, so this is a sample question, and I've omitted parts of it, so would really fit, otherwise it wouldn't fit on the slide at all. It'd be so micro printed that you wouldn't be able to read it even in your books here. But we've got some words here. Define. I guess there's probably a pointer on this. Well, anyway, define, explain, tipping us off to what cognitive level. So what about this define word here? What cognitive skill level is that at? Is it retrieval or is it comprehension? So I heard retrieval and comprehension. So what would make it retrieval? It's only one definition. That's what you're saying makes it retrieval? What would be another criteria for retrieval? That the definition is already stated in the material, right? So if we went to the readings and found a definition for risk appetite, I could open up and say, oh, here it is right here. I wouldn't have to say it as my answer in the same exact words, but I could find that definition in the readings. So comprehension then would be if it's not, the definition is not in the readings, and I have to come up in my own words with a definition, and that would be the next skill level. So we'll look at this bottom one here. We'll come to this. It's repeated up here at the top as the same question. It has the word explain in it up there. This is the learning outcome that goes with that question. So if you read this learning outcome, does it sound like this question? Could they have just taken this learning outcome and typed it on the exam as the question? I mean, it seems pretty close, doesn't it? I mean, look at the wording. Describe the concepts. embedded value, regulatory measures, and demonstrate their use, and explain the rationale for including each of the metrics in Millennium's RAS and how they individually and collectively affect business decisions. I mean, that's kind of exactly what this describe and demonstrate are asking you to do, right? It's just putting it in a very specific situation. And as Dan mentioned, when the exam committee, when an exam item writer puts their question together, it's not just the question that they're creating the answer, but they have to point to a learning outcome and say, my question is based on this learning outcome or these learning outcomes, and they all get listed. So it goes through the review process, gets signed off on, higher and higher levels. Everybody's looking at the learning outcomes and the questions, say, yep, they match up, that's appropriate, we're not going too far. We're not asking for a calculation when the learning outcome doesn't say anything about calculations.
Jim, can I add a couple of things? This is an example of something you talked about earlier. The list is already there of metrics. So
Yep.
we bypass that. So
already right
they
there.
have the 3 metrics. So that way you don't have to recall what common metrics are, but you then have to explain what they are and how they work. But more important, if you then go to the next slide, it says how each of the metrics in Millennium's risk appetite statement and how they individually, to some extent, be expecting an answer in the context of this company, if there's a context. Now, we don't know the whole thing. Is this a case study company? I actually don't think so.
No.
So in this case, Millennium, maybe all you know about Millennium is what's in the STEM. But to the extent that there's information about Millennium that makes it different from a typical company or whatever's unique about it should factor into the answer as well. Because it didn't say including each of these metrics in a generic RAS.
Right. Or just some manufacturing company. Yeah, I mean, one of the tips I give when I talk to candidates is the questions are worded, reworded, edited. And so when the question gets on the exam, the typed exam booklet that you open up and you look at that question, when you're answering the question, you should be thinking, have I used all the information that was given to me in the problem? Because all the words there are deliberately put there. So if it says it's a small company, that probably means something. If it's a brokerage distribution system, that means something. And you're expected to include that information as part of your answer. It's telling you that we want you to answer in the context of a very specific situation. We've told you what the situation is, so dumping a list of just everything you can think of doesn't demonstrate knowledge or application of knowledge to that specific situation. And you don't get very many points for that.
Jim, you hit on something that's very important here. Within the questions, there is never given a red herring. So you will never be given any information that does not apply to the answer or to the question or tries to point you into the wrong direction. Everything on the question will in some way inform that answer.
Could maybe one exception. If the point of the question is to figure out which of this whole sequence of numbers in some sort of financial
like an error
statement
analysis
is relevant,
Yes.
if that's the point of the question.
That's the point of the question. Okay. And one other exception would be if you're given a balance sheet and not every number on the balance sheet may be applied to that question. You have to discern which ones are actually applicable to whatever question or a financial statement. But typically, you're never given a red herring that is intended to try and point you in the wrong direction. That never happens.
Except by accident, right?
We try and avoid that.
Conversely, is it okay to abbreviate, like standard abbreviations, or like how much, because I know extra words in the answer is not good, as well as the question statement. Is it okay to say HDHP? And is that assumed for a high deductible health plan?
I don't know any health abbreviations. So.
Or that RAS, the adequacy statement.
So one tip is a lot of times in the question, like in that particular question we were looking at, RAS is up there as an abbreviation. So that's kind of a tip to say, just use it. We don't expect you to write out that all the time. Standard abbreviations, I would say, are okay, but again, you're communicating to the grader. So if you put down an abbreviation and the grader or the other graders don't have any idea what it is, they're going to try to give you the benefit of the doubt, but if they can't figure it out, they don't know what to do. But you're under a time constraint. You're trying to write quickly, so if you're under, if you think it's a standard abbreviation, you're probably fine. If you're not sure, the first time you use it, just say, I'm using whatever you said, abbreviation, make it clear to the grader. You're communicating to the grader. And they do try to, in the question, like, oops, pushed the wrong button here. I mean, they've used abbreviations in here to try to make it clear that those are fine abbreviations to use. Or even referring to like 1, 2, and 3. You don't have to write all these words out. You can say, number 1, number 2, number 3. So just to finish this section up here, the question then, I would think the natural question would be, okay, you've told me the curriculum committee creates these learning objectives. They have key words in them. Those learning objectives, those key words go to the exam committee. The exam committee writes exam questions. They have those key words in them. They're testing cognitive skill levels. We talked about questions building from retrieval up to knowledge utilization. How much of the exam is at each of these levels? So I don't have an exact answer for you, but you should expect half the exam to be analysis or above, that type of question. So if you go into the exam saying, hey, I've memorized, I bought all those study manuals, all 20 or how many there are, I've memorized every list in every study manual, I know every definition, then you're really down here at this level, and you're not going to score enough points to pass the exam. You have to be able to, whether you use third-party materials or not, you need to understand the material at a level that you can start connecting it all together and apply it to specific situations if it's given in general, or if it's given to a specific situation in the readings, you can apply it to a general situation. It has to get connected somehow.